Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everybody from Newton South and beyond. Really excited to be here to join you. If we haven't met yet, my name is Danny Hoffman. I am the College and Career Counselor here at Newton South High School. I'm really excited that we have a wonderful expert here, Carla from Wheaton, who has been in the business for a long time, to run a little workshop of Financial Aid 101, sponsored and supported by MEFA, which is really one-stop shop for all financial aid support. I'll be sponsoring and kind of continuing to share resources from them throughout the year, as well as many, many other financial aid workshops and resources as we get them. But excited. I'm going to pass it right off to our expert, Carla, and let her take it away.
Thank you, Danny. So as Danny mentioned, tonight's presentation was put together by the Mass Education Financing Authority. So I just want to start by telling you a little bit about them. They're a nonprofit state authority that's been around since 1982. And since that time, they've been helping families plan, save, and pay for college, which includes education about the financial aid and admissions application processes, like the session you're seeing tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about the types and sources of financial aid available, the application process, which is, I'm sure, the most important thing on your minds, how financial aid decisions are made, how people pay for college, and then we're going to leave you with some free resources, including some of those additional MEFA resources that are available that we'll be mentioning throughout the presentation. I do want to mention that when we're talking about the application process tonight, we are going to be talking about it in terms of primarily for high school seniors who would be going through the process this year. So just keep in mind that if your child or if you are not yet a high school senior, if you're a junior or a sophomore, that's great if you're learning about the process early. But you will be going through this process a year from now or 2 years from now, and some of the timelines might be a little bit different then. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to start off by talking about the types and sources of financial aid. So there's three main types of financial aid. The first is grant and scholarship aid, which is money that does not have to be repaid. So it's basically gifted to you from the college or from the federal government. And sometimes that is through the admission application process, and sometimes that is through the financial aid application process. But it's money that you don't have to pay back. So it's everybody's favorite type of financial aid. Another type is a federal or college work-study award. These awards are typically part of a student's financial aid package, but students get that money by getting a job on campus and earning an hourly wage. And they typically get paid in the form of a paycheck rather than having that money be credited to the bill at the school. So work study is usually helpful for students to use for their spending money while they're in school, rather than to go directly toward the college bill. And that's what most students use it for. And then there are federal student loans available that students can qualify for by completing the federal application for financial aid. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in just a moment. So the primary types of loans that are available for students to borrow in their own name come from the federal government through the Direct Student Loan Program. Students do need to complete the free application for federal student aid each year to qualify for these, and we're going to talk a lot more about that application in a little bit. But we do have some information on this slide to let you know a little bit more about these loans. These are typically loans that students would take while they're in school, and they don't have to begin repaying them until they get out of school. They don't need a credit history or credit check. They just need to complete the FAFSA and meet the eligibility requirements of the FAFSA form. There are both subsidized and unsubsidized loans available, and the subsidized version of the loans typically goes to families or students that show financial need. And we're going to talk more about how that's determined during this presentation. You can see here on the slide the fixed interest rate for the current academic year. It's a little bit high, unfortunately, because market rates are high right now. Rates on student loans for both students and parents are a little bit higher than we've seen them historically and a little bit higher than we'd like to see them. Since rates are starting to come down a little bit, I think we're all hopeful that when the government sets the rate for next year's loans for the 2025-2026 year, they might be a little bit lower. The government sets the rate on these loans each May or June for the following academic year, and then that rate is fixed for the life of that loan. So if a student borrows a student loan for each of their 4 years in college, they could have 4 loans with 4 different interest rates, and that is not uncommon. So here you can see that there are some flexible repayment options for these loans. Students do not need to make payments while they are enrolled. However, if they take unsubsidized loans, the interest on those loans begins accruing while the student is in school. They don't have to make payments on them, but the interest will start adding up, and then they can repay it with the principal when they get out of school, or they can make payments while they're in school. There's many repayment plans, which are the government kind of changes them all the time. So not sure which ones will be in place when current high school students graduate from college 4 years or 5 years from now. But they do have income-based plans that where students can have a lower payment based on their income level. The standard repayment plans typically over 10 years. So if a student can afford to make the monthly payments on a 10-year plan, that's what we usually recommend. But sometimes students need a little bit longer with a lower monthly payment, especially if they go on to grad school or professional school. So there are options to consolidate all of your loans, to stretch out your repayments. So repaying these loans provides a lot of flexibility because they're from the student government. One thing to know about these federal loans for students is that the government does limit the amount that a student can borrow each year. And the annual loan limits are in the chart on this slide. So for the freshman year, the maximum a student can borrow is $5,500. And then that amount goes up a little bit with each of the 4 years of college. So the reason that's important is because a lot of times families, especially parents, just think that their child can just borrow a loan through the government in their own name to pay for the entire cost of their education. And with the cost of most schools today, that's usually not possible. So it's important to go through the financial aid application process and see what other types of financial aid you can qualify for in addition to those student loans. So we're going to talk a little bit now about where financial aid comes from, and there's several different places. Most people typically think of the federal government first, and we already talked about the work-study program that's funded by the government and the student loan programs that are funded by the government. The government does also have a few grant programs. The most popular and most well-known is the federal Pell Grant, which is based primarily on a family's income level. So usually the students with the lowest income levels will qualify for the federal Pell Grant, so not everybody will. But that's okay, because if you don't qualify for federal grants, you might qualify for grants from the state or grants from the colleges and universities that you're applying to. There's also private scholarship money available. Most students hear about that from the guidance office at their school. So if Danny puts out any bulletins about local scholarships that are available, pay attention to those and encourage the students to fill out any applications for those. There's also a scholarship search and information on the MEFA Pathway website, which is listed here, and through a private website called FastWeb, where you can go online and do a scholarship search. The one thing we recommend when students are looking for private scholarships is just to not pay anybody to find scholarships for you. So don't pay a website that claims they're going to find you thousands of dollars or a company that says they'll do that for you. A lot of times if you pay someone, it's kind of a scam, and you're going to find that they just give you a list of local scholarships or national scholarships that you could get from someplace like the FastWeb or the College Board's Big Future site. So we generally don't recommend that you pay for that, but if you want to look online for on your own, that's an excellent thing to do. So when financial aid is given out, it's typically given out either based on merit or based on need. And some students will receive one type of aid and some students might receive both. So merit-based aid is usually awarded in recognition of student achievements, most often academic achievements. So a lot of times be based on the admission application. And often to be considered for merit-based aid, you don't need to do an additional application, but that will vary by school. But some schools might also offer artistic scholarships. If a student is being recruited athletically, then there might be some scholarship aid at Division I or Division II colleges and universities. It's a good thing to be aware that Division III colleges and universities are not actually allowed to give out athletic scholarships. So if you're not aware of that and your child is being recruited at some Division III schools, they can certainly consider you for academic scholarships and for need-based aid, but they cannot give you a scholarship solely based on athletic participation or athletic ability. So just keep that in mind, because that is something that's confusing to a lot of people. Many merit scholarships will have a renewal requirement, such as a cumulative GPA that you have to earn each year. Some schools don't have any requirements. You just automatically get those scholarships each year. If you do qualify for some scholarships from the colleges you're applying to, it's a good idea to read the fine print on the letters you get from them to find out what a student needs to do to receive that scholarship each year. If it's solely an academic scholarship, you may not have to go through the financial aid application process to get it. But again, that's up to the school. So if a school wants you to do the FAFSA each year to renew their aid, you should definitely do it. There are some colleges that don't offer any merit-based aid. It's very common, for example, at some of the more elite schools, your Ivy League schools, your very, very selective schools. A lot of those schools offer aid pretty much strictly on a need basis. So you'll have to go through the financial aid application process, which we're going to talk more about, and show some financial need at those schools to receive grants or scholarships, typically. But there are many, many private schools, and many of the public schools too offer merit scholarships. So when you start looking at schools, if you're in the middle of doing that now, check the school's materials, their view books, their websites to find out what types of aid are offered, if there are any special applications you need to do, and what the deadlines are for applying for admission and applying for financial aid. Now, most of the federal and state aid that is available, and a lot of times some of the aid that colleges offer, is based on a family's financial eligibility or need. So in order to show financial need, you will have to go through the financial aid application process, which at most schools will mean completing a FAFSA form, but some colleges have additional forms you'll have to do as well. And when students are considered for need-based aid, a college will typically put together a package that would include grants, loans, and work study, depending on how much need a student shows. And I should mention that even if a student does not show any financial need, it is still possible to borrow a federal student loan through the unsubsidized student loan program. So a student can at least get that if they do the FAFSA. Most financial aid available is need-based, but again, as we mentioned, some schools offer very generous merit scholarships as well. One requirement to have need-based financial aid renewed each year is that you typically have to redo the financial aid application every year, so you have to do a FAFSA each year. And then students also need to be making satisfactory academic progress. This is something that colleges check at either the end of each semester or the end of each academic year. And at many schools, the minimum requirement to qualify for that is that a student maintains a 2.0 cumulative grade point average. And then students usually need to pass 2/3 of the courses that they take. So it's not a very strict standard for satisfactory academic progress, but it is a federal requirement to receive federal aid, and it's a state requirement as well to receive state aid, that students be meeting those standards. So each college has their own policy on that. It will typically be posted on their website. So you can look at the schools you're applying to and see what their requirements are for that each year. Most schools offer an appeal process. So if a student doesn't make satisfactory academic progress, or if they have a merit scholarship with a GPA component, often it's possible for the student to appeal that and get some of the aid back on a probationary basis for a temporary period of time. So now we're going to start to talk about the application process. And as I mentioned already, start checking the deadlines and what applications each college requires. At some schools, you only need to do the FAFSA, but some colleges might want you to do something like the CSS profile form, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Another important thing to note is that you should probably be working on your financial aid applications around the same time that you're doing your admission application. Now, in a typical year, the FAFSA form comes out on October 1st. For the last 2 years, the FAFSA has been delayed because the federal government revamped the form last year. Last year, the form did not become available till January. This year, they expect it to become available on December 1st. I do believe it will be available on December 1st because the government has made great strides in improving the form over the last year, so it should be much less stressful than it was for people last year. And some of you may have heard in the news that a lot of families had difficulty doing the form last year. But we do expect that process to be a little bit more smooth. But because the FAFSA is not coming out until December 1st, if you are applying to a school through an early admission program this year, like early action or early decision, your college may want you to complete some other type of form before the FAFSA comes out. So if you are applying to any of those early admission programs, check with the school to see what they require. The CSS profile form, which is a college board form, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, that's an application that many private colleges require, and that form is actually available now. That one did become available on October 1st. So a lot of private colleges are using the CSS profile as their early action or early decision application with an earlier deadline. So it's important to find out when you're going to need to do these forms and which forms need to be completed by each time. Some colleges also created their own institutional applications for students to do early because of the delays that happened with the FAFSA last year. We actually have one of those at Wheaton for our early action and early decision students, and we're about to send that application out to families to complete. So it's not required, but if somebody wants to get an early financial aid letter, they can do our early form in order to do that. So it's important to find out what the deadlines are because each college is different. Colleges also have different timelines in terms of when they admit students. Some schools start admitting students in December. At some schools, you might not hear until March or April. So it really varies quite a bit. MEFA does have an online college application manager that you can use to sort of organize the colleges that you're applying to and the different deadlines. So that's a helpful tool you can take a look at. So the most important financial aid application, which we've already mentioned a couple of times, is called the FAFSA, or Free Application for Federal Student Aid. Some of you may have completed this form before if you are a parent and you have other children who have gone through the process. I will mention, though, that if you did the FAFSA a few years ago and did not do it in the last 2 years, the form has changed pretty significantly, so you may notice some changes. The FAFSA is required by all colleges, and many colleges use it to offer their own financial aid, but every college will use it to determine if you qualify for federal and state aid. You do need to complete it every year to be considered for need-based aid or student loans. But if you only want a merit scholarship and you receive one from the school you go to, you might not have to do the form for that each year. So again, we expect that this year's FAFSA will be available at the FAFSA.gov website. It's also available at the studentaid.gov website on December 1st. If for some reason it doesn't come out on December 1st, I'm sure the government will make an announcement about that. I do want to mention that if you go to the FAFSA form now, the FAFSA that's available is actually for the current academic year, which is 2024-2025. So if you or your child is a high school senior, you don't want to complete that form. That's no good for fall 2025. You need to do the 2025-2026 version when it comes out. So one of the things about the new FAFSA that has changed over the last couple of years is that people who put their information on the form are now called contributors. And typically the student that's doing the FAFSA is one contributor, and then usually a student who's under the age of 24 will have some parents contributing to the form as well. Either a student or a parent can start the form and invite contributors to finish, but it's very common for a student to start and then invite their parents to contribute. And when a student completes the FAFSA, they'll put in information about their parents, their email address, their phone number, et cetera. And then the form will send an email to the parent to let them know that they can log in and fill out the form. And then once both contributors, or there's in some cases there's 2 contributors, in some cases there's 3, depends on the parent situation. Once all the contributors have put their information on the form can be submitted. MEFA does have another webinar that goes a little more in depth into completing the FAFSA called the Understanding the FAFSA webinar, and you can find that on their website. Now, one of the important things about completing the FAFSA is that all the contributors whose information might go on the form need something called an FSA ID. The FSA ID is a username and password that each contributor gets, so it's unique to the contributor, that they can use to log into the FAFSA, complete it, and then sign it electronically. With the new FAFSA, you cannot do the form without having an FSA ID. So you do need to go online and get that, and you can actually do that now. You don't have to wait until the FAFSA comes out. If you have done a FAFSA in the past and you have an FSA ID, you can use the same one. And if you can't remember what it is, you can go back to the FAFSA website and request, forgot my password, log it, request the FSA ID so that you can find that. One thing I want to mention, because it was a problem with people doing the FAFSA last year, is that a lot of times a student would start completing the FAFSA And then when they entered information in about their parents to invite them as a contributor, sometimes the information they entered didn't match what the parent had set the FSA ID up under. So for example, if a student puts the wrong email address or phone number in for their parent, then it's not going to send the invitation to the parent. They're going to have trouble having the parent contribute. So if you go, when you go in and set up your FSA IDs, and this is true for both students and parents, write down the information you used to set that up because you might not remember it later. And that way, when you go and do the FAFSA, you can enter the same information on the form that you used to create the FSA ID. I honestly don't know why they made the forms so sensitive that if you get something wrong or if you put in a space, it won't let you move forward. But that is the way it was last year, and I would assume it's going to be the same way this year. So little helpful tip to just remember how you set up your FSA ID. Now, as I mentioned, the student will need an FSA ID and they'll be a contributor. And then most students under the age of 24 will need their parents to contribute as well. Now, if a student's parents are divorced or separated, then the parent who will put information on the FAFSA would be the parent that provided the most financial support over the last 12 months. And we'll get a little more into that on the next slide. If for either divorced or, either divorced parents or married parents, whether there's more than one parent that's going to contribute is going to depend on the parent's tax filing status. So if a divorced parent has remarried, then they will put information about the step parent on the form as well. And that step parent might need to be a contributor as well if the parents file married filing separately or don't file a joint return. For married parents, if they file a joint return, then usually only one parent needs to contribute. But sometimes they will ask both parents to get an FSA ID and contribute. It just depends. The form will tell you what to do when the time comes. There were some problems last year for students who completed the form who were US citizens or permanent residents and had a social security number, but whose parents were not US citizens or permanent residents and did not have a social security number. The government has worked a lot to make that process smoother. So we do expect that will work this year. It should be much easier for families to do that. So if any of you are parents who don't have an SSN and you heard sort of the horror stories about what happened last year, I do think that that's gotten better. We have several families where the parents do not have social security numbers. We have parents who live in foreign countries, and they have been able to complete the FAFSA. It took a little while, but I think the government has worked out most of the kinks with that process, so that should be better next year. So we've talked a little bit already about what goes on the FAFSA, but just to give you more information, there will be questions about the student citizenship status, and students who are US citizens and eligible non-citizens can receive federal financial aid. If a student is not a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, and eligible non-citizens are typically permanent residents or people who are in the process of getting permanent residency. So unfortunately, DACA students, temporary protected status students, are not usually eligible for federal financial aid, and neither are undocumented students. But some colleges may still tell you to do the FAFSA if you have a social security number because they might use it to consider you for institutional aid if you are not a US citizen or permanent resident. And here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the rules have changed over the last few years so that students can receive some Massachusetts financial aid. And the Commonwealth actually has their own application for undocumented students to complete, which is called the MEFA. So I think if you go to MEFA's website, they have more information about that process. So when you do the FAFSA, you will list the colleges that you want it sent to, and all of those schools will receive your FAFSA. So you don't have to do this multiple times. You just put a bunch of schools down when you do it the first time. And then if later on you apply to another school, you should be able to log back into the FAFSA after it's been processed and add additional schools. We already talked about parents a little bit, but if parents would be contributors, if the student's parents are married, then both of their information goes on the form. And, one of the parents might need an FSA ID or both might need one. It depends on their tax filing status. Parents who are unmarried and live together both have to contribute to the FAFSA. And in that case, both of those parents would usually need an FSA ID and would be contributors. We already talked a little bit about divorced separated parents. Again, for a divorce, in a divorce separated situation, it's the parent who provided more financial support in the last 12 months and that parent's current spouse if that parent is remarried. This has changed a little bit over the last couple years for anybody who did the FAFSA years ago and thinks that this sounds strange. For divorced and separated parents, it used to be the parent that the student lived with that would complete the form. But under the new FAFSA, the rule is now it's whichever parent provided more financial support. And if parents provide equal support, you are instructed to use the parent with greater income and assets to complete the FAFSA. I did one of these sessions about a month ago and I had a parent ask me, how would schools determine which parent provides more support? And the answer is at most schools, we do not plan to determine that. We're going to let you determine that. And we don't really have a way to tell, even if the one parent might make more money than another one, we don't really have a way to tell who's paying for what and who's providing more support. So you can figure that out with your child. Put that parent down. In some cases, it's really clear. In some cases, it might be a little bit less clear. And I don't think a school will question you on it unless they have some conflicting information. For example, if they collect information from a non-custodial parent, which is something that CSS profile schools might do, and they see that one parent's income is dramatically higher than the other, they might ask you questions about that. But most schools are not going to question this. They're going to use whatever parents you put down. A legal guardian is not considered a parent for financial aid purposes. So a student who is in a legal guardianship and has court documentation that would show that would actually be independent for financial aid purposes. And when they complete the FAFSA, they would put that they're in legal guardianship on the form. The form will then bypass the parent information and base financial aid eligibility on the student's information alone. I will caution you, though, that you should not answer yes to the legal guardianship question unless you have the court documentation to show that, because we do usually request that at schools because so many students make mistakes on that question. Legal guardianship is a very specific status. It's not the same as custody. It's not the same as emancipated minor, which is a different type of status. But grandparents should not be putting themselves down as a parent. Foster parents should not be putting themselves down as a parent. Those are usually situations where the student might be considered independent. So if you're not sure, if you have that situation and you're not sure how to handle it, you can always give one of the schools a call, the financial aid office, and we'll be happy to go over the situation with you and let you know how you should complete those questions. Now, one of the things that the FAFSA asks about is number in the family. With the new FAFSA, the government pulls a lot of the information on the form directly from your tax return on file with the IRS, which makes the form a lot easier to complete. So if you have, and it's going to be based on 2023 for the 25-26 FAFSA. So if you have a completed 2023 tax return on file with the IRS, they're going to pull your income information from that. And they are also going to look at how many people were claimed on the tax return and use that to determine the family size. So if your 2023 tax return as a parent does not reflect the number of people that are actually in your household, because sometimes it's not the same as who's claimed on the tax return, then you can correct that on the FAFSA. They will ask you the question and you can either answer it or you can leave it blank. If you leave it blank, they'll pull that information from the tax return if they have access to your tax return. And I should mention too that the FAFSA does sort of an immediate check to look for your tax return on file with the IRS. And if they don't find it, then they will prompt you to enter your tax information manually on the form. And if it does that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the IRS doesn't have your tax return. It could just mean that, like, if you filed late, the IRS maybe hasn't processed your return yet. So it might just not be available for this process that FAFSA uses to pull the information. Now, another question on the FAFSA is number of children attending college at the same time. Some of you who have been around for a while and have older children who have done this before might know that used to affect your financial aid eligibility if you have more than one child in college at the same time. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. So your eligibility for financial aid based on the FAFSA will not take into consideration the number of children that you have going to college at the same time. But the question is still on the form, and you should still answer it accurately because some colleges are going to use that number in college to give you some additional institutional aid. So it's worth answering the question because you might get lucky. And if you're applying to, I think that's especially likely to happen at a private school. If you're applying to a private college that has some institutional aid, they might give you some additional aid because you have more than one child in college at the same time. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, they're going to be looking at your 2023 income, and hopefully for most of you, they'll find it with the IRS, which will make the form easy to do. One thing I should mention is that the FAFSA will make all contributors, so the student and the parents, give consent to pull this data directly from the IRS. And it may sound like giving that consent is optional, but it actually is not. So you have to give consent, or the government will basically send you a message saying you don't qualify for any financial aid. So even if you're uncomfortable with the information coming directly from the IRS to your FAFSA, you don't really have a choice in the matter if you want to receive some federal financial aid. So you do have to give consent. All contributors must give consent, even if you don't file a tax return. Even if you're a non-filer or the student's non-filer, you have to check off the little box to give consent, or your FAFSA basically will not proceed and you will not get any aid. There will also be some questions about assets on the form. Not everybody has to fill these out. So you might not get questions about the assets based on your income, other information on the form. They might bypass them. But for some of you, you'll have to provide some information about your savings, checking, investments, businesses, and property outside of the home you live in. You don't have to report the value of the home you live in. But for all other assets, you would report the net value, so the value minus the debt as of the day that you're completing the form. If you have education savings accounts, such as a 529 plan, those are reported as a parent asset, and you only report the 529 plan you have for the child that's going to college. You don't have to report it for all of your children. This is another change to the FAFSA. You used to have to report all of your 529 plans, so this is actually a beneficial change that will help some families. Again, don't include the value of your primary home, your retirement accounts, or life insurance. Very, very common that people put their retirement accounts down. Don't do that. You don't have to report those. And if you receive child support, you'll report that on the form as well. And if the calculation that's going to be used to determine your eligibility for financial aid, we'll actually consider that an asset. And assets are counted a little bit less in the formula than income is, so it just means it helps you a little bit in terms of your eligibility. There's no place to report debt on the FAFSA, except that when you report assets, you'll subtract out the debt that you have on those. So if you have outstanding educational debt for other children or for yourself, there's no place to put that, unfortunately. That's the kind of thing that you can let colleges know about individually. Some colleges might consider that as an appeal or special circumstance, and some colleges will not. Now, I mentioned a couple of times that there's this additional financial aid application called the CSS profile. If you are applying to some expensive private colleges and universities, you may have to do this form. It's a form that's put out by the College Board, and you can see their website here is cssprofile.org. It did become available on October 1st. So if you're applying to some schools that require it, you can start working on that application now. You don't have to wait till the FAFSA comes out. And unlike the FAFSA, which is a free form and you should never pay for, so if you wind up on a FAFSA form that tries to charge you a fee, that's a fake FAFSA form. So don't ever pay to do the FAFSA. But unlike that, the CSS profile does have a fee associated with it. It's $25 for the first school you send it to and $16 for each additional. You might only need to send it to a couple of schools though, so it may not cost very much money. And there are fee waivers available for parents in certain income levels. When you go online to the CSS profile website and start completing the registration for that form, they will let you know if you qualify for a fee waiver. Now, unlike the FAFSA, the divorced parent will complete the original CSS profile, but then non-custodial parent will need to submit their own version of the profile if the school requires it, and a lot of CSS profile schools do. MEFA does have a What to Know About the CSS Profile webinar, which you can find on their website. So if you're doing some profile schools, that's a good resource. You can go to the CSS Profile website to find out what schools participate in it. There's a list of schools there. And then in addition, the CSS Profile is probably sort of the most popular additional financial aid application that schools will have you do. And there's a whole group of schools that require that. But some colleges make up their own financial aid application that they'll want you to complete. And as I mentioned, this year and last year, because of the delays to the FAFSA, a lot of schools made up their own early financial aid applications that you could complete before the FAFSA comes out. So check with the schools you're looking at to see which forms they need you to do. Now, you're going to do the FAFSA for everybody. And I know sometimes people really don't want to do the CSS profile because it's a pain. It asks for additional information. But I will say that if you are applying to one of those schools that requires that form, they're going to use that form to give out their institutional grants and scholarships. And a lot of the schools have a lot of money in grant and scholarship. So I would do the profile if the school wants you to. It's really important to do it to get access to all that financial aid. At a lot of those more expensive schools, most of the financial aid money comes from the school itself and not from the federal government. So you want to keep that in mind. So after you do these applications, the schools will receive the forms electronically, as long as you list them on the schools. So on the form, so you don't have to make copies of the form, print it out and send it to us. We can't really use those. We wait till it comes through our system. You'll receive a FAFSA submission summary by email. So that's how you know your FAFSA has been processed. Colleges might reach out to you using the email addresses that are on either your admission application or your financial aid applications to request additional information. Some schools might want to see a copy of your tax returns. Some schools might have questions about the information you put down, or if you left some things blank on the FAFSA, they might reach out to you and ask about that. So you'll want to pay attention to any emails you get from the schools, both their admissions office and their financial aid office, and make sure you respond to those as quickly as possible so that your admissions offers and financial aid offers are not delayed. At some schools, the financial aid award might go out with the admissions decision. That will also depend on, if they have your FAFSA at the time that they admit you, or if they have like a CSS profile or another application. But at some schools, you'll hear about the admissions application first. You might also hear about a merit scholarship if you're getting one of those at the same time. And then it might be a few weeks or even, a month or two after that you get your financial aid. It just depends on when they get their financial aid applications in relation to when they're admitting people. So you can talk to the financial aid offices at the schools you're applying to and ask them questions about how does the financial aid get renewed? Like, will you get a similar amount every year? Does it change every year? Do you have to reapply every year? If you get an outside or private scholarship, is that going to change the financial aid that you get from the school, or are they going to let you have that on top of the financial aid that you got? Special circumstances are changes you would want to let colleges know about, and that would include things like if your income has changed and gone down since 2023. So since this form is going to be based on 2023, if you've had an income loss or a job loss in 2024, that's something you want to let the colleges know about. You might want to let colleges know if you have unusual educational expenses because you have more than one child in college, and it's going to be difficult for you to afford things based on one child in college. If you have unusual medical expenses, that's another thing you can tell schools about. So these are things to ask the financial aid offices about. Some schools have a special form that you'll fill out. Some schools will just tell you to email them or send them a letter. And at most schools, you can call them. You can send emails, and then some schools have sort of like a real-time web chat on their website. Those are usually schools that have like a lot of staff that can be on the chat and answering your questions. But usually, you should be able to get in touch with a financial aid office if you have a lot of trouble getting in touch with them. And keep in mind, certainly during like March and April, schools are going to be busy. So it might take a day or two before you hear back, but you should hear back from the school within a few days. And if you don't, you might want to be concerned about what kind of service you're going to get from them when you go there. So most financial aid offices will be happy to talk to you. So we're going to talk a little bit about how financial aid awards are put together. So it starts with every college looking at their cost of attendance for 1 year of school. And the cost of attendance includes the tuition and fees at that school, the charges for room and board, an estimate for books and supplies, which can vary per student, an estimate for transportation, and an estimate for personal expenses. So to give you an example, a lot of private schools, when you add these things up, the cost of attendance might be $40,000 or more. Then from the FAFSA, a number will be created by the federal government called a student aid index. And this is a number that represents a family's financial strength. So for some families, it could be as low as negative 1,500, which means they really can't pay much of anything for college. And for other families, it could be, over $1 million. So there's a wide range in between. The same federal formula is used for every family. Income is weighed more heavily than assets. Some colleges use an institutional formula, which is different from the SAI, and that would be based on the CSS profile usually. So if you're doing the CSS profile, they might be looking at slightly different information, like they might look at your home equity, for example, and they might look at a non-custodial parent, which is different from what the FAFSA does. The student aid index and the college's institutional formulas are based on the assumption that the family has the primary responsibility for paying. The SAI is not necessarily what a family will pay. For example, if you have a negative 1,500 SAI, that doesn't mean you're going to get money back. Like that's basically treated as a zero in the financial aid calculation. So you may still have to pay something. You certainly won't have a negative number for that. And some families, will find, depending on how much financial aid they get from the colleges they're applying to, that they might have to pay more than what the SAI suggests they should pay. MEFA does have a pretty good SAI calculator on their website. So if you're really anxious to find out what yours looks like and you don't want to wait till December 1st to do the FAFSA, you can go onto their website and complete it. So to figure out a student's financial need or financial aid eligibility, college will take their cost of attendance, subtract the student aid index, and the negative SAI is treated as a zero when doing this. And whatever's left over is the student's financial aid eligibility. So to give you an example of this, here we have a college where their total cost of attendance for 1 year for a student is $45,000. So that's tuition fees, room and board, books, personal expenses, transportation, etc. So here we have a family where they've done the FAFSA and their SAI is $5,000. So to determine the family's need, the college takes their $45,000 cost and subtracts the $5,000 SAI, and what is left over is $40,000. So then the school will put together a financial aid award, which includes grants and scholarships of $27,500, student loans of $5,500, a work study award for $2,000. And if you add up all of that financial aid, it comes out to be about $30,000. So the family would have to pay their SAI of $5,000 to go to this school. They would also need to come up with an additional $5,000 because there's unmet need that the school couldn't cover. So there are some colleges out there that meet families' need 100%. And if they do that, they'll typically advertise that on their website. But a lot of colleges don't have the resources to do that. So you might wind up paying your SAI and some additional money as well. Another thing that's really confusing to families is that sometimes you might apply to several schools that have similar costs, but you might get very different financial aid awards. So we have an example of that here. We've got 3 colleges that all cost about $45,000, and we have a family with an SAI of $5,000. But the 3 schools have put together very different financial aid packages. So College A has given the student $40,000 in financial aid, which consists of $32,500 in grants and scholarships, and then some student loans and work study. So the award from College A is a really good financial aid offer because it contains mostly grant and scholarships that does not have to be repaid, and it meets the family's need 100%. So this family is only going to have to pay the $5,000 SAI to go to that school. If you look at the other 2 colleges' awards, they're not quite as attractive. And there could be several different reasons for that. So if your child wants to go to College A, that's a pretty easy decision. That's a great financial aid package. But if your child wants to go to College C, then you might have to talk to College C about why their award is different, and if there's anything that can be done to bring it closer to the other school. There's a lot of different reasons why the award could be different. It could be that College A has more money available to give, or has a policy of meeting everybody's need. So they just might have more scholarship money to give. Could be that College C is a more selective school, and maybe the student doesn't fall at the top of the applicant pool there, so they're not getting as much financial aid. So a lot of different reasons why this can happen, but if it happens to you, it's okay to call the colleges and ask them what the appeal process is, if they'll consider competitor awards, and how schools approach that is different from school to school. Some schools will say yes, some schools will say no, but it never hurts to ask. And sometimes you might get a better offer and be able to attend the school that you really want. So we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about how you can pay for college, some different ways to do that, and then leave you with some additional resources. So this slide just sort of shows some different ways you could pay a balance of $20,000. So if you are lucky enough to have some money put away in some assets or some 529 accounts, some savings, certainly you can use that. That's a great way to avoid taking loans and paying interest. If you have enough current income, monthly income to pay on a monthly payment plan, you could put a portion of what you owe on that or even the entire amount. Or you could borrow an additional education loan. And there are parent loans available, and there are also student loans that students can apply for through banks and organizations like MEFA, as long as they have a credit-worthy cosigner. And you can borrow, typically with those additional loans, you can borrow the entire amount that you need, or you can borrow a portion of it. So you can use one of these methods, or you can use all three. It's fine to do a combination. Most colleges offer a monthly payment plan where you can divide up your balance into installments or a portion of your balance into installments to make it easier for you. Schools will typically send you information on the payment options at their school when you decide what college you're going to go to. These are some things to think about as you're starting the college application process and starting to talk about what can we afford. You know, what is each school's net price and which one is going to give you the best deal? And is that the school that you want to go to? And is it a good idea to make that decision based on money? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. You can save a lot of money if you're willing to start at a community college and then go to transfer into a four-year school 1 or 2 years later, especially now because Massachusetts has a new program that you've probably heard about that provides free community college to students who don't have a degree. So certainly now, if you want to save some money by starting at one of our state community colleges, that's a great way to save some money. And we have a lot of students here at Wheaton that transfer in from community colleges. Most of the private schools do, and the public universities and the UMass system does as well. Consider the number of children you're going to send to college, because if you have more than one child who's going to go through school, you don't want to spend all the money on the first one. Some families do that, and then by the time their younger children get to college, they're tapped out. We see that all the time. And think in terms of how much debt you're willing to take on, what the student's potential starting salary is for their chosen field, and whether it's realistic for them to repay that debt. If a student's going to go on to graduate school or professional school, they might need additional loans then. So you want to keep your total debt borrowing low, even if that means maybe going to a less expensive school, like a state school, or a school that gives you a lot of grant and scholarship money, even if it's not your top choice. Massachusetts has a lot of great new financial aid programs, primarily for the public universities and colleges in the state. So the community colleges, the four-year public universities, and the UMass system have all of these programs that are listed here. And MEFA has a nice webpage you can go to find out more about that. So if you're considering some of the public schools in the state, there's honestly not a better time to look at them. And I say this as someone who works at a private school and competes with them. But I used to work at Framingham State, and it's a great time to get great deals at some of these schools. Most of the state financial aid is need-based. So if you don't show a lot of financial need, you are going to pay probably closer to sticker price at some of those schools. But even the sticker price is reasonable at a lot of those colleges. And if you do show some financial need, you will probably get a lot of financial aid money from these schools right now. So certainly, if you don't have your heart set on going to a private school, it's a great time to consider those public schools in Massachusetts. So here in Massachusetts, we offer a program called FAFSA Day. You can go to the fafsaday.org website, and those are online FAFSA completion events where it's a Zoom like this, but somebody will go into a breakout room with you and help you do your FAFSA one-on-one. We have these Mass Educational Opportunity Centers around the state where you can get assistance applying for admission and financial aid or learning about career services. And then MEFA has a lot of valuable information on their MEFA Pathway site, which is also listed here. We have some QR codes here that you can use, and you can also just go to MEFA's website, which is mefa.org, to find out about their other webinars, some of which are recorded, some of which are upcoming, which are really helpful and cover all different topics about both admission and financial aid. And if you haven't done so already, you can apply for your FSA ID now, so you'll be ready to do the FAFSA when it comes out. Just make sure you write down the information you use to create those FSA IDs. And then MEFA's on the various social media sites. You can connect with them. And now we can take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Carla. There's so much information in there. It's all just a lot to comprehend. So don't stress if you don't have a question right now and you're just overwhelmed. You can circle back. Again, we'll upload this video later. And there are lots of great resources out there. And you can come find me at the College and Career Center. I will walk through this with you as well. I've filled out the FAFSA over 100 times, and every single time I do it, I learn something new. So just keep breathing and take it one step at a time. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll get to them as best we can. If you are ready to roll and you're like, all right, I'm good. Have a great night. Thanks for being here. But I want to do